Dear people in the audience and dear speakers, you are warmly welcome to this webinar on hybrid threats, security policy, and democracy in Sweden and Finland. My name is Janne Wikström, and I work here at Hanaholmen Cultural Center for Sweden and Finland with cooperation between the countries in higher education and research. Bästa publik och bästa talare, ni är hjärtligt välkomna till dagens webbinarium om hybridhot, säkerhetspolitik och demokrati i Sverige och Finland. Dagens diskussion sker på engelska, men frågor och kommentarer kan ställas skriftligt i chatten, också på svenska och finska här i Zoom, i chatruutan i Zoom. Hyvä yleisö ja parhaat puhujat, tervetuloa päivän webinaariimme hybridiuhista, turvallisuuspolitiikasta ja demokratiasta Suomessa ja Ruotsissa. Keskustelu käydään englanniksi, mutta kysymyksiä ja kommentteja voi esittää kirjallisesti Zoomin chat-toiminnossa suomeksi ja ruotsiksi. Dear attendees of this webinar, I encourage you to ask questions and comment the presentations by writing in the chat box here in Zoom. I will pick them up and address them to our speakers. Our discussion today is a part of Hanaholmen's series, Research on Democracy in Sweden and Finland. In this series, with circa 10 webinars during 2021, we are highlighting current research on different aspects of democracy in our countries. We define research on democracy broadly and do not only focus on the classic representative democracy, but also how different sectors in our countries function as parts of our democratic societies. There are many reasons to run this series this year. We are observing changes and shifts in our societies and in local, regional, national, and international politics and relations. But we also have a number of jubilees related to democracy in Sweden and Finland this year. For instance, the celebration of 100 years of democracy in Sweden and 100 years of autonomy for the Åland Islands. And last year, there was the 60th anniversary for Swedish Finnish Cultural Foundation, who also is the overseer of Hanaholmen. As a part of this last mentioned jubilee, a research anthology on democracy in our countries was published. It also contained a chapter on security policy. I just mentioned shifts and changes in our societies. Among these, you can surely point out hybrid threats and security policy. And I'm glad to have two eminent scholars on these issues with me today. Please let me introduce Pro Vice Chancellor Malena Britz from the Swedish Defense University and Adjunct Professor Teija Sederholm from the Finnish National Defense University. Cordially welcome, Malena and Teija. Malena, you can present yourselves informally with some words here before we start with the presentations.
Thank you so much. My name is Malena Britz. I'm an associate professor in political science here at the Swedish Defense University, where I'm also a Pro Vice Chancellor. As I will say later on as well, what I present here, I don't really do it in my role as Pro Vice Chancellor, but in my role as a researcher. So it builds on previous what I've written previously. Just so you know. Thank you.
Malena, one more question to you before we start with presentation, or before we hand over to Teija and start also with presentations. Can you tell quickly how you got engaged with research on security policy? What made you interested in this academic field?
Well, I've been researching different aspects of security policy since the end of the 1990s. Where I started to write a PhD thesis on the Europeanization of defense industry policy in Sweden, a topic that has come back quite forcefully actually in the last couple of years with the European Defence Fund. And during this course, I've also broadened my interests and away from defense industry policy and defense industries to broader areas of security and defense, and then cooperation within also societal security and sort of softer parts of security. So I have a quite wide interest in Swedish security and defense policy, in Nordic security and defense policy. I've also written a little bit about what happened around 2006 when the Nordic countries started to talk about security policy. And then Swedish-Finnish cooperation is one of the latest topics.
Thank you, Malena. And perhaps we will touch this interesting comparison between Sweden and Finland in general, and research on security policy and your universities in particular, since researchers as Teija Sederholm, who will present herself in any second now, here at the Finnish Defence University, researchers are also officials or part of the Finnish Defence Forces. So that puts those research in a little bit different position than researchers like Malena at the Swedish Defence University. But Teija, would you like to present yourself and a little bit also elaborate on that difference?
Yes, so warmly welcome from my side also. So as you said, I come from Finnish National Defence University, which is part of Finnish Defence Forces. But National Defence University is just like any other university. Our main focus is to educate officers, but also to participate discussion in society and comprehensive security and so on. So when I work here as a researcher, I'm a normal academic researcher, just I would be in any university in Finland or anywhere else. I have made research related to situation picture, information flow, and control rooms and so on. And now we have focused on studying social media. And this information, as I will soon tell you, and I'm sure you know, is a quite important thing currently in social media and in affecting people's mind and to society.
Thank you. Actually, I think you could go ahead and start with your presentation, so we get some hard facts presented here.
Okay. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
All right, can you now see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so today I will give you a short insight of the results of our project, which has been funded by the Academy of Finland. Social media, as we know, has a bright side, offering a lot of joy and information. However, it also has the dark side. As we know, social media has become an ever-growing national and international security threat, and it's currently one of the key channels for distributing disinformation and to affect our minds. It's also a key instrument for modern political activism. Our focus in the National Defence University has been on young people to gain a deeper understanding of their agency in social media environments. It's undeniable that social media is a core part of young people's everyday reality. If we think of the meaning of the word war, its modern meaning is not just about a weapon going against another. The concept of war is much broader and has elements we call hybrid warfare, and information warfare. We also have a term cognitive warfare, meaning a battle over our minds and thoughts. The main weapon is spreading disinformation, aiming to have a psychological effect and to change our values and way of thinking. Using disinformation as a weapon is nothing new. Messages and propaganda have been spread aiming to mislead, to frighten, and to demonstrate capability to the adversary. Therefore, the weaponization of social media is quite natural. The success of disinformation is based on its appeal to people's minds and their beliefs. Therefore, it has been successful in creating rifts between citizens, diminishing citizens' trust in public authorities and the political system. This has increasingly caused polarization in the society. The role of psychological resilience has been underlined as a fundamental factor underpinning the security of Finnish society. When we think of psychological resilience, one important aspect is trust. In general, Finns trust each other, but what is more important from society's point of view is the fact that the Finns trust authorities. Why then is trust so important? In addition for maintaining social order, societies with higher public trust are perceived to be more resistant to information influence, as trust promotes a sense of security and facilitates cooperation and interaction among citizens. Simply, it has a major impact on society's susceptibility to disinformation and resilience. Information influencing activities have malicious intentions aimed at affecting the perceptions, behavior, and decisions of the target group. The different techniques are geared towards exploiting shortcuts in our thinking, either by learning about us through the data we share, or by applying nudges that manipulate our cognitive biases. Memes are an excellent example of this. Many young people use social media 24/7, and they are often targets of political, commercial, and social information intended to influence their opinions and actions. Notable is that young people with weak digital skills are often more fragile and vulnerable than their more highly skilled peers, and thus easily exposed to hostile actors or trolls. While thinking of the dark side of social media, young people, we must remember that social media is also exploited by cyberbullies as well as by perpetrators of more extreme violence. We interviewed police officers working with youngsters and social media. From the interviews, we identified three main threats concerning young people's social media use impacting national security. When something happens, rumors, misinformation, and disinformation fill social media. In addition, fabricated stories begin to spread on social media, sometimes even within 10 minutes of the first official news of the incident or the attack. The speed and the quality of the false material is such that in addition to curious citizens, there has to be organized groups behind the disinformation. It's easy to organize large-scale gatherings and swarming on social media. This leads to at least two risks. First, it would be possible to organize massive gatherings or mass brawls, endangering bystanders and affect feelings of security. Secondly, it's possible that some malicious actors would try to exploit this phenomenon for their own purposes. Capitol riot in January was a good example. Third point is that idolizing violence and criminality has been identified as a phenomenon in some youngsters. Young people can watch exceptionally violent videos like the mosque shooting video from New Zealand. Social media is also effectively used in radicalization. From national security point of view, the long-term influences on opinions are more concerning. Many players, such as extremists, know how to use incidents to their advantage and affect public opinion by creating negative impressions related to society and public authorities. Target groups are planned in advance, focusing on gaining more supporters and visibility in the media. It's notable that some young people seek this kind of action and they look for groups where people share, sometimes even quite polarized ideas. We made a questionnaire study in Finnish Defence Forces conscription call-up. 84% of respondents believed they could distinguish between a reliable and a fake news story. In addition, 74% felt they were in full control of their social media use. These results indicate a high level of confidence among respondents, both in their ability to detect false information and in their ability to use social media. When we achieved the results, we doubted them and assumed the high percentage were due to a small sample size. When our research consortium made a national survey for young people with the same questions, it had a sample size of 800 and a wider demographic from 15 to 19-year-old. Our previous results were replicated. Only this time, young people were even more confident in their ability to distinguish real news from the fake ones. In this wider survey, 91% of respondents trusted their skills in detecting fake stories. To conclude, young people are social media citizens, and while using social media 24/7, they may constantly exposed to information influencing. Trust has a major impact on how individuals perceive their personal and national security. Weaponized information is one way to foster polarization and to consequently destabilize a population. Thank you.
Insightful presentation. I hope it will raise comments and questions from our public. I cannot see any of them yet, but we can address them later. And hand over to Malena in Stockholm. Please feel free to start your presentation, Malena.
Okay, as I said, I'm here in my capacity as a researcher, not as in my capacity as a Vice Chancellor. I would also like to say that the Swedish Defence University, for those of you who don't know that, is a university under the Ministry of Higher Education. Ministry of Education, so we are a higher education establishment as any other university in Sweden, except from the fact that we are the only ones who educate officers for the armed forces. So I have actually a third disclaimer here, and this is a sort of an apologetic one. I apologize a little bit because what I will present is sort of a Swedish perspective. The research I've done in this area so far has been from the Swedish point of view. It's about Swedish-Finnish cooperation in security and defense, but it's from the Swedish point of view. And I realized that there might be other aspects that you would have seen if you had studied this from the Finnish point of view, and maybe you could bring them up in the discussion ask questions in the chat and we can discuss that. What I'm going to talk about here builds mainly on a book chapter that I wrote last year for the Swedish-Finnish Cultural Fund, Kulturfonden för Sverige och Finland, who organized a book that's called Partiernas vägskäl, ett nytt politiskt landskap i Sverige och Finland. That book chapter in turn builds on a journal article that is not yet published, but I hope it will be published in a foreseeable future, about the role of military innovation in the Swedish sort of resurrection to the total defense. I will talk a little bit about that in my presentation. And also a book chapter that I thought about when we discussed Teija's presentation here, which I find very, very interesting, because a lot of what I will talk about in Swedish and Finnish cooperation has to do with territorial defense. But if you have a broader concept of security and you look at social media, for example, you might question whether the way that you look at territorial defense is an appropriate way of viewing threats in the way when social media, for example, becomes a threat. And this is something a little bit not in the context of social media, but in context of sort of the difference between territorial security and how you see security. I discussed with a colleague here at the Swedish Defense University called Rita Holmberg in a book chapter that we wrote a couple of years ago. So I would just like to put a little bit Swedish and Finnish defense cooperation in a general context, and some of the political developments and the evolving threat pictures that have been the background to this cooperation, you can say. I mean, traditionally, security and defense policy have had a special role in all countries. It has, to a lesser degree than other policy areas, been part of, for example, the parliamentary process. It has more been a policy area for the government, where the government has tried to achieve long-term policy. And has done that then in cooperation with all the political parties normally in their country, but it hasn't been part of a sort of a parliamentary democracy process, but a bit more special. And it has also meant that traditionally during the Cold War, defense budgets were not really debated that much. It was generally accepted that defense budgets should be high. This is something that changed and shifted a bit at the end of the Cold War in a lot of countries, not as much in Finland, but in Sweden, for example, this trend was clear. It has also been clear in other European countries. And we discussed this, my colleague Rita Holmberg and I, as a sort of a normalization or democratization of the policy areas of security and defense. And in Sweden, you could actually go so far as to say that you could see a trend of desecuritization, where defense policy for some years was really started to be leveled with other policy areas, and you could start to discuss things that hadn't really been possible before, where you could compare the Swedish defense budget to other policy areas and say, well, should you spend this much on this area when you could spend it on schools, for example, or teachers, or healthcare. So this was an important shift, and one aspect that we discussed that I think is very much connected to Teija's presentation here is the expectation of the general public and the expectation on transparency, for example, that increased during this time, but also the accessibility. You have that sort of citizens have much more accessibility to what happens in these policy areas than they had before. And that really relates, I think, to Teija's presentation, where social media is out there, it's for everyone to use. So it could be used with good purposes and with bad purposes, and you could always question sort of authority, what had been seen before as authority sources, for example, articles by a well-known journalist and they can be discussed today and criticized and questioned in a way that they couldn't be before, because the information was much more, it was confined to spaces that the general public didn't have access to as much. In Sweden, this trend shifted after the war in Ukraine. So I would say that the Swedish defense and security policy now has sort of returned to a securitized policy area. But obviously some of the ideas of transparency and how the democratic processes should work have been a little bit affected. But the trend shifted back after the war in Ukraine. If we look at Nordic cooperation in security and defense in general, the tradition for the Nordics were that security was created without talking about security. So the Nordics cooperated a lot in other areas, as you know, but not really in security and defense. And it had to do with, for example, different memberships in NATO, but also differing threat perceptions. Where you can, if you compare Sweden and Finland, you can say that the Swedish threat perceptions has shifted much more over time than the Finnish threat perception. It has been much more stable. But obviously, different memberships in NATO affected the possibilities to talk about security. The change here, from my perspective, came in 2006, as I mentioned earlier, when the Nordics actually started to talk about explicitly, talk about security and how security could be created with more cooperation. And one important part here is the creation of the NORDEFCO framework in 2009, which is a Nordic framework for defense cooperation, an institutional structure, you can say, for cooperation. However, even though this framework was created and it has advanced and developed quite a lot over the years, cooperation has mainly been bilateral still. So when you look at actual cooperations, they have been either Swedish-Finnish or Swedish-Norwegian or Norwegian-Danish, or well, as you see it. The Swedish view on increased Nordic cooperation has been ambivalent, and I would say that the reason for this is that the advantages have been clear from a Swedish perspective to increase cooperation, but the disadvantages have been unclear. So, sort of what would it mean for the Swedish security policy? How much can you cooperate without actually entering into military alliance or a defense union, for example? Those kind of queries have made the Swedish view a bit ambivalent, I would say. A part of this is also obviously the at times differing threat pictures between Nordic countries. A vital point here is that the transition that Sweden made, though, from a neutrality policy to actually having a solidarity policy, where the phrase that the politicians use right now is that Sweden should create security together with others, which is very different from pursuing an active neutrality policy. That is a vital transition in order for any deeper defense cooperation to take place. I have divided the Swedish-Finnish defense cooperation in two phases, where the first phase was from around 2008 to 2014. And what you can see here during this time, and especially in the beginning, there was an increased economic pressure on defense policy. And then cooperation in defense became a way to actually achieve more bang for the buck, as they say. So you would be able to maybe maintain your capacities and your capabilities through cooperation. Because in 2008, the idea, at least in Sweden, of an increased defense budget was very far-fetched. In 2008, the Swedish and Finnish armed forces then presented a report on increased cooperation. I also want to say, for sort of as a point of order, that there was a similar report between the Swedish and Norwegian armed forces in about the same time. So there were a lot of different talks about how can we sustain our military capabilities with less money, and then cooperation was one of the answers to that question. In Sweden also at this time, the political priority, and this is important, shifted from a territorial defense to focus on international operations. And this meant two things in particular. The planning for a Swedish total offense was stopped, and also the general conscription was paused. So those are two important things that happen that show this sort of shift. And then the idea was that when we cooperate, we will do it in international operations. So cost savings and the ability to participate in international operations and thereby be part of an international security structure, you can say, were driving forces for the cooperation in this first phase. In the second phase then, this changed, and the reason for this is the war in Ukraine. In 2014, the Swedish and Finnish armed forces, they were then asked to present a course of action or a handlingsplan for deepened cooperation between Sweden and Finland. What had been done up to then, everyone was very happy with. So the politicians wanted the armed forces to present a report on how cooperation could be deepened. And that report was presented in 2015. And 2015 was also the year that the Swedish defense policy retreated, you could say, to Swedish territory. And important aspects of that, of course, was that general conscription had to be started again, and also the planning for Swedish total defense was also started again. What you can see here, I think, is the importance of shared threat pictures for possibilities of cooperation. If you have different threat pictures, it becomes difficult to cooperate because you don't really know what the substance of that cooperation should be. So when the Swedish, what you can say that is that when the Swedish threat perception became closer to the the Finnish threat perception that had been there the whole time, then the possibility to cooperate became bigger. The report then in 2015 showed concrete suggestions on areas where further cooperation could be pursued, but it also mentioned and pointed out some, as I think, interesting challenges that we have seen after that. They pointed out that some of the laws that you would need to have more similar would need to change. Resources, for example, culture and practical difficulties, and the issue of secure communication, which is a big one, and where the Nordics actually started to have secure communications between their ministries of defense in 2016. The focus in the cooperation between Sweden and Finland then changed from exercises to more concrete planning. So it was taken, you could say, to sort of a practice area to plan for the use of the cooperation. In both Sweden and Finland, changes in laws were necessary. And in Sweden, this was made through a commission of inquiry that was published in 2018, and then the law came into place in 2020. And from the Swedish perspective, the purpose of increased Swedish-Finnish defense cooperation changed. After the war in Ukraine, it changed from the idea to use cooperation as a way of sustaining military capabilities, even if you have a decreased economy. It changed into an idea of how you could increase actually capability and reach threshold effects. So you could say that it has gone from a sort of a defensive way of using security cooperation to a more active way of using security cooperation during this time. And this, of course, as I said in the beginning, has to do entirely with the changes within Sweden. I wouldn't want to say how the sort of the focus of this cooperation, if that has changed from the Finnish perspective. I would guess it has been more stable because of a more stable threat perspective, but I would be very happy if someone could comment on that or ask a question about that. That would be good, I think. Thank you so much.
I think we didn't manage to start the screen sharing there of your presentation, but I copy pasted the most central parts, aspects of your manuscript in the chat windows, so the audience, the attendees can also read it from there. And I guess it's okay for you, Malena, that we share it per email to the participants, to those who signed up.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
No problem, no problem.
I said everything in my PowerPoint, so.
Yes, I know that because I've seen them as well, obviously. And as I already said, I copy pasted in the chat box there the most central aspects, and especially this really nice timeline from the last 15 years, what's been happening, and your argumentation regarding those actions. Yes, both of your presentations were really convincing and insightful. I think they complement each other really well. Teija gave us an insight how individual use of social media can, as a summarized force, be a hybrid threat towards national security of any country in the world at the moment. And you again, Malena, showed us how these really big external geopolitical developments, but also domestic policy affect the decisions made in security policy and the planning of it, policy planning. Converging threat perceptions seem to have played an important role for the possibilities of increasing cooperation in research on security policy between Sweden and Finland, and also the planning of security policy between our countries. I think that Teija, from her position, cannot comment the latter, the security policy itself, but she can surely comment the possibilities to increased cooperation in research on security policy, hybrid threats, and the research you already done, Teija, regarding the use of social media. How do you see, Teija, how do you look at the importance of international collaboration? Your study, the one you referred to now, was a national one from a Finnish perspective, but how about similar bilateral between Sweden and Finland, or even more international research cooperations on that topic? What do you think of that?
Yes, I think it would be very interesting to broaden our research to Sweden and maybe to other northern countries. And we have actually started cooperation with Förvarshögskolan with another area. But I think this would really be something that we could get more insight, that are the results similar in Sweden? So are the young people thinking the similar way and using the social media similar way, and are the threats similar to society? So that would be really interesting.
Yes, and Malena, now I have to ask you, not in your position as a researcher, but as the pro vice chancellor, and the research work done by your colleagues, or then by scholars at some other Swedish universities. Are you aware of any like similar projects to the one Teija has been working with?
I mean, we have some projects that work on strategic communications, for example, which you could see the use of social media as a way to work with strategic communication. So the social media, from my perspective, is a tool really for strategic communication. So that we have. And yes, we have some researchers who do this. But could I just say something what I think is very interesting? Because what you can see with Teija's presentation is that, I mean, traditionally, if you think of cooperation in security and defense, you think of cooperation around capacities that are very physical in a sense, the traditional military defense. And here we have a threat that is very, very different from that. So it's really interesting to think about how do you actually cooperate around if you want to defend yourself against these kind of threats, and how do you create cooperation when the sort of the previous cooperation you have has to do with much more tangible issues. And social media threats, I think, is something that politicians should really think about cooperating around, because, and I know they do it a little bit in NATO, for example, and also in the EU to a certain extent, but because social media has no boundaries, it has no territory, no given territory, and you can use it the same weapon in different countries. Everyone is speaking English more or less, and you can. So from that perspective, I think this social media as a threat poses a different kind of threat picture that you have to think differently around, and bring sort of your best practices. But the question is what those would be, and that is something that I found very interesting with Teija's presentation, I must say.
Thank you. Would you, Teija, like to comment that?
I mean, now, yes. Yes, that's actually so that it's not territorial. We don't know where our enemy is because it's somewhere, and it can be anywhere. And I think the reason why we are focusing on young people is because they are the future, as we know, and the media literacy skills and the ability to understand what really is disinformation or even just misinformation, or the memes. So memes are actually a very good way to spread disinformation and to affect people's mind, because they are usually funny. It's humor, and you don't even realize how they affect to your mind. And this is about the long-term influencing. And that's why I think it's very important that we are aware that the young people must learn what is this disinformation and information influencing, so that they understand it. And it's not just about the security threats, but it's also related to the everyday life, like consuming. They are following social media influencers who have a very strong effect to their daily life and how they think about the world and have the values.
Thank you, Teija. Now we got the audience, the attendees really active here. And Terhi Tikkala wants to address the following question to Malena. Do you think that the threat images still diverge between the Nordic countries, or would it be time to create a common risk and threat picture analysis?
I think they have converged quite substantially actually in the last years. However, given that, even if I say that, there are still some differences, I would say. Norway, for example, has a closer eye at the Arctic area, for example, and Denmark is, well, a little bit somewhere else. But otherwise, except of that, I think that the threat perceptions have increased. And if you think about these hybrid threats or softer security threats, then the Nordics are all in the same boat, and they should really start to make common threat perceptions, I think.
Actually, the next question is a really good link to the statement you just made. The last sentence you mentioned, Malena. Henrik Stolpe is asking, I guess both of you, Teija and Malena, do you think the global big tech companies take their responsibility in stopping hybrid war or possibilities to hybrid warfare?
I think Teija should answer first.
Yes, Teija, what do you think of the role?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it has been now very clear that these companies have a huge global power, but they are doing business, and personally, I don't think that they are not going to giving up their power. And what like Twitter did in this Capitol riot, so I think it was just to do something, but I'm very skeptical that anyone can force them to really do something.
Yes, and I would like to ask you both, Teija, in your presentation, you had a really good definition of the importance of trust and trust building in our societies. And Malena described this development from territorial and tangible threats to non-territorial and non-tangible threats. And social aggression on social media as one of these possible non-tangible threats that Teija pointed out. Do you think that the policy security policy making is and trust making in our societies even more generally, not only through security policy, but through any policy field? Is it more difficult because of these non-territorial and non-tangible threats?
Yes, I think if we think COVID-19, so the public authorities are doing their best to deliver clear information and how we should do, but we know that there are lots of conspiracy theories and people believe them. They watch the YouTubes, they see the memes, and they share this misinformation in Facebook, Twitter, and if it's someone they believe more than they believe like health authorities, so it's really a threat.
What do you, Malena, think about my question?
Well, yes, it's a different kind of threat, and from my perspective, the interesting things have to do with how do you meet those threats? Do you meet them with police forces? Do you meet them with the armed forces? How do you get different? Because these, and it also has to do with the question about big tech. I mean, we have to work with, you could say, actors here that our liberal democracies are not really set up to work with these kind of actors. They are not set up to work with Twitter as an agent in causing insecurity, for example. So a very big and interesting question is how do you set up the democratic system so that you could actually somehow handle these agents that are not, I mean, the system is not made for these kind of actors.
And now we have a question from the public. And that person asks you both regarding control in our societies. is it not a psychological war to increase control both from states and companies? And how can that be handled by us individuals and also by the states? Who wants to answer that question or comment it?
I could come back to my previous thinking here, because I mean, you could see, for example, when Twitter says that the president of the United States cannot send tweets anymore, or he's not allowed to use Facebook. I mean, that is for our system, that is a very strange thing. We don't really have the means to handle that. And that is not only a problem for the president of the United States, who can do whatever he wants to within his own country, but not on the internet, and not because there is an international body somehow who says that this is illegal behavior, you should be punished, but because of the tech companies taking such decisions. And they are not in any system. I mean, they're not in any international system for rules or how you, so that is, but that is also obviously a problem for individuals. And we know that in countries that are not democracies, this is a huge problem, where you're actually not allowed to use your speech and speak in a free way and communicate in a free way, and where you can always be surveyed. There's a sort of a surveillance issue here that is a completely different one. So I think our society, we will have to work very, very hard within our systems to find the right balances here, obviously, between surveillance and control and liberties, because we want the democratic societies to be sustainable. But then we have to protect them, but not overprotect them, and not protect them in a way that we actually sort of suffocate democracy itself. And it's a very, very difficult balance, of course.
Yes, and Teija, how would you?
Yeah, this is a very difficult challenge, and because we are democracies, so we cannot have so much control of what people are doing on their free time and how they use social media. So I think the key is that, like, now we have all learned how to wash our hands to protect ourselves. So I think we should all learn how to recognize information influencing and to be aware of it, so that we can protect ourselves.
Yes, I would like to get back to increased cooperation, not only in research on security and defense policy between Sweden and Finland, but perhaps also in the education and training in security policy. Do you see a possibility to a joint, perhaps not a consistent degree, but parts of degree structures, like common joint study modules in cooperation between your two institutions? How do you think about that?
Is that to me, or? Yeah, well, yes, why not? I mean, we have a lot of cooperation in both education and more practical training, and obviously the whole aspects of strategic communications, and as you say, Teija, the importance of being sort of savant knowledgeable in the area of information operation as an individual. I think it's a very, very important task, especially for the officers in the armed forces, because they are key personnel and vital for the defense of their own countries. So obviously the importance of educating officers in these areas, and how to call a lie when you see it, so to say, is very, very important.
Yeah, I think that we could do even more cooperation but to just everyone to know that we do cooperate together. Like yesterday, I had a 3-hour meeting with Swedish, Norwegian, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Switzerland researchers, and we are doing research together. So, but of course, you can always have more cooperation, and I think this is really the area that we will discuss, Malena, that how we can proceed with this, because as you said, that it's also important in officers training. So if we have something that we could utilize each other's knowledge.
Yes, thank you. I think that our time is up soon. Is there something that you would like to ask each other, Malena and Teija, or comment these issues on research on security policy in general, and cooperation and hybrid threats in particular, the things you highlighted in your presentations? Or are there some comments or questions from the public? Yes, there now came just now one popped up, one question here. I will read it. Henrik Stolpe wants to ask you, during Donald Trump's presidency in the United States, lying became more than okay. How big problem is this for Sweden and Finland? I think Henrik Stolpe means like politicians speaking like non-true, things that aren't true. So do you believe that is a problem for Sweden and Finland?
Well, I think that media has an important role in this, so that media checks the facts and tells people that if the politicians are not speaking the truth. And we also have some fact-checking companies here in Finland which are actually doing this. So I think that is something that will stay in from now on. The fact-checking will be kind of normal procedure. And the politicians are aware in Finland, at least, that if they lie, the risk that they get caught is very high.
Yes, Malena?
Yes, it's the same thing in Sweden. I mean, if any good has come out of all those lies, is that everyone is very aware that politicians can lie. And as Teija said, journalists and major media, they really engaged in fact-checking. So I think that the awareness around these issues has increased. The extent to which people get away with lying, though, I wouldn't really know, but at least media is trying, and also, as Teija said, some other private companies are engaged in this area as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm really thankful for the presence and contribution from our speakers, and of course also you attendees with your insightful comments and questions. We are continuing this series already on the 6th of May, our series on research on democracy in Sweden and Finland. On the 6th of May, with a discussion on research on political polarization in our countries. Please visit our website for more information and a link to the registration form. And now I'm wishing you all a joyful start of May. Thank you. Bye-bye.